we've got to talk about Christmas. Hello and welcome back to The Commonplace. My name is Autumn Kern and I'm here to talk to you about Christmas. I love Christmas. I think that, here's the thing about The Commonplace, what I like to do is I like to look at modern sayings or ideas and ask classical questions about them, usually using principles to say, is that true? Because sometimes it's not true. I don't know if you know this, but we, just like every other time period, every other person in history, have blind spots. And the great thing about reading old books and thinking about old ideas is that they reveal your blind spots to you. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk a little bit about some phrasing that I often hear during this time of year as we enter Advent and Christmas, and I want to ask, is that true? But before I do, I want to tell you that over on Patreon, I have a new guide, which you will now see here, called Liturgia. And I'm talking about liturgy and basically learning how to rightly love, which is of course the point of education and formation in our time in God's world. And so I look at it from a couple different angles in the guide. I look at the theological liturgy by doing an overview of the church calendar, how Christians have historically practiced both feasting and fasting, learning about Christian martyrs, learning about church history, different things like that, practicing the meta-narrative of scripture, living out the drama of Christ's life throughout the year. And then I also talk about something I call commonplace liturgies, which are just the everyday things you do, because the things that you do repeatedly do something to you, which is what we're actually going to talk about today. So I just want to make sure you knew that was in there. It's only available in Patreon, which is $7 a month. It's not going in the shop right now. And if you do know, Advent has begun, and so it is a great time to maybe think about those things. But let's get to today. So when it comes to Advent and Christmas, this holiday season time for moms, I find there are two ditches kind of presented to us. And I think that we as classical homeschooling moms who think about these things, read about these things, try to order our lives after the ideals of virtue and wisdom, I think we know that both of these aren't true, but I'm going to cover them before I dive into the one I want to talk about. So the first is that you must be the perfect sugar plum fairy. You must buy everything possible on the market. You must execute it perfectly. You must never sleep and never rest and never sit and all wonder yourself because you are so busy being a Pinterest perfect mother. I think we all know that's not true. Now the second ditch over on the other side of the road is that you don't have to do anything. In fact, this time of year can be really overwhelming and we don't want to burden you, so you should just go off by yourself. You should really focus on loving yourself a little bit more this season. You don't need to do anything. Don't even pick up, don't even get dressed. You just don't need to do anything at all. And I think we know that one's not true either. Now the one I want to talk about is this sneaky one that comes up, and I say it because I've written this line before, I've thought this before, and I think that it comes into the Christian circle this time of year, particularly through things you'll see on Instagram or on Pinterest, and I just want to ask, is that true? Because I have a couple classical principles to throw your way, just to give you some food for thought. And the line is, you don't need to do anything this Advent or Christmas season except think about Jesus. Is that true or false? Let's talk about it. So the principles that I want to pull in today, the first, they're going to kind of meld together. I'm not going to break it into two different parts. You'll just listen for both. The first is that people are full persons. Meaning, if we think about children are born as full persons and we talk about the whole person that we're forming in education, we have mind, body, and spirit. We have multiple parts. We are not primarily brains on sticks, as James K. Smith says, and we are not primarily thinking things. We have other parts to us and therefore other parts that need to be formed. That's the first classical principle. The second is that festivity is a muscle that must be learned. It's not the same thing as gluttonous entertainment and a constant intake of things. So the first big one that underlines all of it is that you and your kids are people. God has made you as image bearers and you have many parts to you, and he uses all of those parts in revealing himself to us and to forming us and to showing us his love. He doesn't just focus on our mind. I mean, if you just look at the pages of scripture, you are not primarily dealing with instructive text as in this point, this point, this point. You're dealing with a lot of story. You're dealing with poetry, prose. Your imagination is called into play. Your heart is called into play. It's not just your brain, and that's important. Because we as people, we would say as classical educators that we know that we are formed by the things that we think, that we love, and that we do in the world. Focusing only on one part leaves the other parts of us to atrophy. It's actually very dangerous. It's how we end up malnourished and malformed. And so when we start thinking about people and how we are engaging our children in this time of year, it might be wrong, I would say, to think that all you need to do as a mom is make sure that you are thinking the right things in your house. So that's the first thing. And the second part of it that isn't explicitly said, but I think comes to play, is that we are saying that it doesn't matter what we do during this time of year. really, except out of the other side of our mouths come March, when life is a little bit less hectic for moms or requires a little less work and effort on our end, we will also say things like, the way you change diapers matters, the food you serve matters, the way you decorate your home to bring in beauty matters. And so we say that the ordinary mundane matters, and it does, we're entirely right, but then we get to these big feastal seasons where a lot is asked of a mom. I'm not saying this is easy, what I'm saying, but I am saying that we are asked to maybe do more and maybe serve longer and maybe make more things and make more messes and engage our children in other different ways than we do the rest of the year, because it's a special time of year. And the specialness of the year actually reminds us in the mundane, ordinary times of year that the ordinary matters. We know that because we have the big celebration and ideal of the feastal seasons before us to show us that the ordinary is working in that direction ultimately. And so these things, this festivity, this personhood, it all comes to play. Now, why do we even hear this, right? Because I think it's meant in a couple of really good ways, and I don't want to ignore that in this little conversation I'm having with myself here. I think when Christians come in with this type of phrasing, what they're trying to do is one of two things. The first is that they're trying not to burden a mom. It's a big no-no in our time and place to burden anyone, to say that there's an ideal, to say that you might have to work harder because you yourself are being formed in deeper, better ways. It's not okay to say there's an ideal and you have to match that you aren't the center compass of truth, goodness, and beauty. That gets really dangerous in these days, in these times. And so it's hard for someone to say, actually, historically, the church has practiced different liturgies or has practiced different traditions because they understood that we are formed on all parts of who we are. And so we need to engage all five senses, all three main parts when we think about mind, body, and spirit, or mind, body, and soul. That's just not something that kind of lands really well on the internet these days. And so I think that's one part of it. I think the second part of it is that there's the fear that someone will think, well, if I do all of these things, then I've earned like a gold star with God. And we know that's not right either, right? We know that we're not trying to earn this place of righteousness, but we are part of a faith that does believe that our faith works itself out in good works. And so we actually are called to bring it out of our heads and through our fingertips into our homes as Christian moms. And that's kind of where I want to pivot, just so that we can continue to explore the personhood parts. Like, what does it look like in your house? Because guess what? Take note, I'm not affiliate linking a bunch of things you need to buy for Advent and Christmas. You really don't need to buy anything out of the ordinary if you have just like normal life-giving things in your home. This isn't a time of year for you to be purchasing and feel like, oh, I don't have the exact right perfect thing. I'm not even telling you the exact right way to do this. I'm just saying that the practices are important because faith is a mystery enacted. It's something lived out in the particulars. What goes on in your mind should change your heart. What goes on in your heart, which is really how you pursue things in the world, right? You're primarily a worshiper, not a thinker. And so those two should interplay, but then be lived out. Otherwise, it's like intellectual virtue. If it lives in your head and never progresses into meaningful action in the world to love God and to love neighbor, it's really not virtue. It's not doing anything for you. And so faith is not primarily about having just the right set of beliefs, which means actually we have a time and a chance this time of year to engage our children in deeply formative ways. It's not usually that someone's like, the Christian faith was so logical, I had to be a part of it. No, it's someone loved me so well. I heard this story. The gospel was brought to life through a service where they played with the colors and the smells, like all these different things that really captured me in this deep way, which we would talk about our souls in that regard. It captured me and I couldn't look away. That's typically how people talk about coming into the Christian faith. And we think about our children, we're trying to form their imaginations and their loyalties to a person, to a king, a real king, which we're going to talk about in a second. How do we act around a king? And so it actually is important to take pause this season and to think about, just start with the five senses: sight, smell, taste, touch, sound. You know what your five senses are. I get those all out of order when I say them in a row. To think about the five senses and how they are engaged in your home. Do you change out the art? Do you change the music played? Do you change the smells of your home? Are you baking special feastal foods? What are you eating? What are you gathering around? What are you pointing to in this season for your children to see that this is how Christians respond to a king? Because that's what we're doing. Advent is a time of waiting, a time of preparing, a time of longing for a coming king. Christmastide, while a celebration that the king has come, is still a recognition that we are in the already, but the not yet. We actually are celebrating as joyful people in a weary world that's still broken. And so we have this chance to show our kids this is how Christians live. This is how we respond to our King, our hope for him to return again. And that's really powerful. The way you pray, the way you gift, the way you read, the way you feast, the way you fast, the way you sing, the way you clean up the toys can all point to that, capturing their imaginations and their loyalties. Because it's not just what you think. Because if you really do stop and think about the incarnation, which is wild, if you think about that, it should work itself out into your life. It should change how you think about embodiment, how you can make something like truth, goodness, and beauty be something that your children can taste and see and smell. It should change how you see your child, how they are the image bearer of God, reflecting back to what we know and what we long for. And it should genuinely shape the things you do this season. So it's not a list, again, of you have to do it this exact way, or you're burdened by someone's standard of what a good mom is doing. It's just an invitation into God's love, into knowing him, and to showing your kids what that is like. I'm in America. I know what's really fun about the Commonplace Patreon is we have people from all over the world, but we do not have a royal family. We don't have a king. It's like this neat idea. We're like, oh, isn't that fun? Like, Christ is king, amazing. He's gonna rule. He has a kingdom. But we don't really know what it's like to live with allegiance and love to a king. And so sometimes when I talk about this with people, I'll bring up the idea of like, if you had a king, like actually in your country, and he was coming to your home, you would not open the door and the house would be cold and nothing would be cooking and you'd be like in your PJs with your top knot hair and you'd be like, hey, I'm so glad you're here. I'm really glad you're here. If you could just slide over that laundry pile on the couch before you sit down, that'd be great. Let me go find the kids. Not sure if they're clean. You would never do that, right? If you had a king coming, your house would be warm. You would have cleaned that weird spot behind the toilet. You'd be wearing your favorite outfit. You would have made the best food you know how to make. Your kids would have decorated the house with like paper chains or something. It would be so exciting because a king was coming to your house. The king was coming to your house. And it wasn't that you did all this so that he would then like you. No, he's a benevolent, good king. You know he loves you. Whether or not you've done that, that is just the natural overflow and response of love and excitement. And I think that translates significantly, clearly into this time of year for the mom. That if you just sat around and told your kids, like, yeah, Christ was born, that's what we think about, we know these truths about him, you're missing the chance to engage with the rest of them. You're missing the chance to make what is reality more clear in front of them. Because let me say, the world is about to explode. It's Saturday after Thanksgiving when I'm recording this. The world is about to explode in song and dance without a king, for a Santa Claus and a reindeer with a red nose. They're gonna go all out. And we as Christians sometimes say, yeah, you don't really have to do anything, it's fine. Just make sure you tell your kids the right things, and that's all they need. It's just not all you need, I don't think. I think when you take those principles of personhood and festivity, learning to exercise those muscles, because gluttony is not the same thing as festivity, right? It's a different sort of thing. It's a Christian sort of thing. And you have the chance to do it with your kids, which is so remarkable. And so I'm not saying there's one way to do this. And I'm not saying that you have to do it the way my family does it, or that you need to go buy a bunch of things in order to do it. But I am saying that what you do this Advent and this Christmas actually really does matter for you and for your kids. Because my guess is that you are like me. And maybe you've thought that same line before. Like I said, I have written that in a microblog when I used to like microblog on Instagram. I have thought that, I have believed that it only mattered that we had right thought in our home. But what I am realizing is that you can have right thought and your house can still feel like it is always winter and never Christmas. And no one wants to be the White Witch in that story. See you guys next time.